Thank you, Chair. Just to begin, I'm not an expert in this particular area. Excuse me. I'll be drawing on life's experience, I think, more so, in order to oppose a proposal that Irish citizens abroad should get a vote in presidential elections. I'm going to rely on 5 interrelated key topics that I'll flesh out over the next 15 minutes or so. The first one, and it's been mentioned by an earlier speaker in relation to, which is a transposition of James Otis's catch cry, which is no representation without taxation. In other words, the right to a vote should come with a particular obligation, and that obligation is that you share in the burden of paying tax. And I know this may not particularly resonate with presidential elections, but it will follow on that there is an interlink to that. I'll give you a very, very simplistic analogy of that. I come from a farm, 7 children. Every Christmas, 4 of my siblings, we go home for Christmas dinner. We all chip in, we all share in terms of buying what's going to be eaten at the Christmas dinner. And if I take my brother who lives in Kildare with his wife and 4 children who doesn't come down for Christmas, and we all love very well, I just think it would be unfair that he would ring up and say, well, in actual fact, I think you should spend a little bit more and maybe not go for turkey, you should maybe go for goose, that you shouldn't buy wine, that you should buy orange juice. In other words, have an input in terms of how a dinner is had at our home that we're contributing to and that he has no contribution to. Now, I know that's a very simplistic argument. However, it does resonate somewhat in terms of the collection and distribution of tax. The vast majority of citizens in this country and residents, they pay tax either directly or indirectly, and that, despite what Jenny says, even the poorest do contribute indirectly, whether it's buying a bag of coal, they do pay VAT on that, so they do contribute indirectly to the taxation of the country. So they have a right in terms of how taxation is collected and distributed. And for example, if there is a particular policy, and if we consider one of the parties, Sinn Féin, who say that there should be a third rate of tax of 48% on portions of income above 100,000. Now, that might seem a very good idea to an Irish passport holder in Omagh or in Brisbane. It has no impact on that individual. However, it does have a direct impact on a resident in Ireland who is going to the polls to vote on a particular issue and for a particular party. In relation to how this applies to the presidential election, what I would say to that, and I know it's come up earlier this morning at some tables, which is that allowing a vote for the presidential election to me would be a foot in the door for a general election to the Dáil, and it would be the thin end of the wedge in relation to the electorate process generally. I would say that there has to be a principle, in other words, that you either have a right to vote or you don't have a right to vote. And if it applies to a presidential election or a general election, I think it should apply to both. That principle should apply, and it comes back to the principle of no representation without taxation. Furthermore, the presidential role has a very important role. So in other words, let's not underestimate what the president does. And if I can just look at two particular roles of the president, the Article 26 powers, which in some effect brings very important matters to a higher level of public discourse. I know that the president, through Article 26, cannot prevent a particular law going through. However, it does raise it to a higher discourse. And probably the lesser discussed power of the president, which is the power to dissolve the Dáil at a very particular point in time of a state's existence. So in other words, the president has the power to dissolve or not dissolve a Dáil, and I think that's an extremely important power which should not be underestimated. And it goes back to whether or not that should be the right of the citizens living in the state or people living outside of the state. The third point I'd raise is in relation to sufficiency of knowledge of citizens of Irish passport holders living outside of the state. How much knowledge can a person living in Australia or America have in relation to particular candidates or particular issues that may come up at a point in time? I know certainly social media, Skype, has certainly improved the flow of information. The fact that you can now read the Irish Times online in Australia or America certainly helps that. However, in reality, how closely do people follow current affairs in Ireland to know the issues or the candidates involved. I have a sister who lives in San Francisco, and certainly, and she comes home every year. She claims to have a particular interest in current affairs, but when she comes home, you can see that it doesn't really exist. For example, the last presidential election, she discussed the candidates in that. She would have a very particular view of Sinn Féin that goes back to 1970, 1980s. That particular view would certainly bias her in relation to the candidacy of Martin McGuinness. And I would say that she's just not keeping abreast of the evolution of Sinn Féin over that 10 or 15 years. And I think that's certainly missing when you're not immersed in the current affairs of the country. In my own particular position, I was away for 2 years working in the former Soviet Union, and I would have a keen interest in current affairs. Excuse me. And at that time, the local and European elections were taking place, and I had a postal vote. And I followed it in as much as I could at that time, 2004, and as much as you could follow from abroad the types of issues and the types of context that needed to be discussed around local and European elections. I did vote, but I would have to admit that I certainly did not really truly understand the platform from which the person I voted from for both of those elections, where they were coming from. So if we move on then to, just for a minute, on to the amount of people who hold Irish passports abroad. I know it's been discussed this morning. There are approximately 3 million people abroad holding Irish passports. And if we consider that in the context of the 1.7 million people who turned out for the last presidential election, and if all of those people had a vote and decided to vote, certainly you would have, I would argue, a very strong skew in relation to the result of that election. I would question whether people would be making decisions based on knowledge and based on context, proper context, and whether that result would indeed be skewed. If we consider the ancient order of Hibernia, going back to the Good Friday Agreement, a very influential body in the US who would have a certain, we would have to say, a certain influence over Irish Americans and Irish people in America, well, they were opposed to the Good Friday Agreement, which we all, I think, would accept today was a very, very important step in the evolution of our state. So what I would say is that a well-considered organisation such as the Ancient Order of Hibernia, if that was their view, how informed and how much in context were they with their opinion? I would also argue that people abroad arguably have a more radical view than people at home. They would probably have a more romantic or patriotic view of life than we would here, and that perhaps their views could be formed without context. And there's also the possibility of a potential backlash vote from our citizens who have moved abroad, who are angry with the financial situation. And would they be making decisions based on their emotions, as the saying from, based on information and context? A further point I'd raise is in relation to the 3 million Irish passport holders, and where do you actually draw the line in terms of who is allowed to vote and who's not allowed to vote? Certainly, if you take, again, my sister, who has 3 children, all 3 of whom have who've dual passports, would you allow them to vote in a presidential election? So if that's the case, then where do you draw the line? And you end up with an extremely large number of people outside of the country vis-a-vis voters inside the country. Also, you would have to ask in terms of the person who is a very keen follower of Irish current affairs, who's been living in London for the past 20 years, against the person who has absolutely no interest in current affairs, who's been living in Australia for the last 4 years. So what's the time frame that you're talking about? It certainly poses very complex challenges. And ultimately, I think you end up at who is really deciding the type of country that we want to live in today, whether it's people who are based on information and absolute context, as a thing from idealism and probably a romantic view of where Ireland is today. In terms of practical issues, and I know some of these came up earlier on as well today, the cost of the external vote, I won't dwell on that. I believe it's 5 to 20 euro. The timing of the issues, if we take the last presidential election, votes cast on Inishbofin, Clare Island and Inishturk, they were cast on the 24th of October 2011. That was the day of the infamous Frontline debate. So in other words, they didn't have the benefit of seeing that Frontline debate. Would that have changed their views? So in other words, if you're going to have voting in some shape or form, whether it's postal or voting stations set up abroad, how far back do you have to actually do those votes? And will they get the real issues that perhaps a lot of them only really come to light towards the very end of the campaign? I'd also have a question mark over the security of the voting abroad in terms of fair and free elections. Campaigning abroad and the rules that we have very strictly in this country in relation to TV and radio in terms of fairness and balance, the limits on spend in relation to campaigns. I would ask a question: will TV stations in the US and the UK, will they comply with our regulations in terms of fairness and balance in terms of spend? I would suggest that they would not. So, in opposing the motion, I would say that the right to vote comes with an obligation, and that obligation basically involves sharing in the tax burden. Secondly, I would question the quality of decisions that people abroad could make in relation to voting in the presidential elections. And from my own experience, the amount of information and the context, you don't really have it, and you cannot really make a quality decision. Thirdly and finally, I would say that the difficulty in managing the process would certainly, or at least arguably, lead to a skewer of the results. Thank you.